Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear's Frights 4 A Step Closer, Story 1 Step Closer, Part 2. Suddenly he felt lightheaded. He then blinked to imagine a way. What a dumb idea, Mom. Pete, it's not that dumb, and it hurts my feelings for you to think that. Yeah, Mom. Mom was into expressing her feelings lately, too. He shoved his chair away from the table and stood up as his face then flashed cold, then hot. I'm not doing it, Mom. Pete! I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to bed. Pete walked over out of the dining room. What happened? He heard his mom ask to Chuck, and Chuck sighed. Puberty. Hurry up, Pete. The next morning, Chuck banged on the bathroom door. If Pete didn't get out soon, Chuck would be late for the bus to W.H. Jameson Middle School. If he had missed the bus, then he would have to ride his bike 5 miles to school, and his mom would freak out over his going alone. She was already paranoid about if something would happen, and if Pete wasn't with him, then, which he didn't understand, since he was already almost 12, 11 and a half. Lots of his friends were already by themselves all the time doing stuff like that, but not Chuck. Pete always said that it was because Chuck was such a baby and their mom couldn't stop thinking of him in that way. He heard Pete heave into the toilet, and Chuck stepped back and cringed. Pete was sick, he figured. Chuck's lips then curled a little. That's what he deserves for trying to scare me, Chuck thought. He can't scare me. He tried to scare me yesterday, but it didn't work. Then he let that go, though, as Pete then heaved again, stepping back and leaning against the wall to wait. Chuck knew Dad's leaving had changed everyone. So, Pete was angry all the time, and Mom kept searching for new things to make her life happy. As for himself, he just tried to keep busy. He liked to hang out with friends, and he liked to play online video games, and he was pretty interested in puzzles, so, yeah. Middle school sucked, but going to school was just a part of life that you had to go through, or at least get through. Even once in a while, he had felt changed by a project. Then he'd complete it, and then get bored again until something else caught his interest. He got why Pete hated him all the time, especially because Mom made Pete have to watch him so much, and he tried not to be annoying, but everything that came out of his mouth seemed to annoy Pete. Maybe it was just that maybe it was just that way with all brothers, Chuck thought. Chuck didn't know because he didn't have another brother to compare to. The toilet flushed a minute later. Pete swung the door open. A wave of serious stink waved at Chuck as he waved a hand in front of his nose. Pete didn't look so good. His face was so pale. His freckles stood out like tiny bugs on his cheeks. His dark hair stuck up in different directions, like Pete had jammed his finger into a socket, and it shocked him himself. And there was also dark circles under his eyes, like he didn't sleep at all last night. Geez, Pete, what's the matter with you? Nothing, Pete spat out. Something didn't agree with me. Probably something from that stupid Freddy Fazbear's Pizza place. Chuck didn't think so. Do you want me to call Mom? Pete then shoved him aside. No, I'm not a little baby like you, Chuck the chump. Chuck felt his shoulders stiffen. I hated that stupid nickname. Whatever, he chose to say as he mumbled. He then slammed the door and locked the bathroom door behind him. Pete chugged an energy drink with triple caffeine while running to his bio class, but he still felt drained and exhausted. He had some pretty crazy dreams last night. He couldn't remember much of what they were, only that there had been all this blood, and it was everywhere, pouring all over him, down his face and over his chest and arms, and when he jerked awake, his blankets were tangled around his body. He'd fallen to the floor trying to unwind the blankets so that he could just rush to the bathroom and blow chunks. He then shivered just thinking about it, but he rolled his shoulders and shoved that not-so-fun memory away. He probably should have stayed home. But calling his mom at work would have freaked her out, and she would have been asking him a million questions, so he decided to get through the day somehow. He then looped into class 5 minutes after the bell had rang. Mr. Dinglewood, you were late, drowned Mr. Watson in a bored voice. Note. Pete then snatched off his hat and shook his head in a negative way. He took an empty stool at the workstation in the far back next to a kid in a black leather jacket with purple hair. Gravity and fall were towards his face. The point of the tiny blade that was coming straight for his eyes, adrenaline spread out. Pete ignored that little flash that he just had. Pete then zipped his hat into his pocket, his pack, and then set it on the floor. He then whipped some sweat off of his forehead, and he shifted awkwardly onto the stool. Why couldn't he seem to keep still? As I was saying, class, we will be dissecting a frog for the safety rules for tools and procedure. You will work as a team with your partner to fill out the lab sheet. I expect you all to be mature young people, and I know that will be hard for some of you, but there is no funny business here, or you will fail, and you do not want to fail my class. You have 30 minutes, so now get started. When they both turned towards the dead frog Anyway, let me re-say that. When they both turned towards the dead frog sprawled out in front of them, leather jacket guy leaned forward. Dude, what's the matter with you? Pete shook his head. Nothing. Leather jacket guy gave him a yeah right look on his face as he picked up a small scalpel. 10 minutes in, Pete yawned. His mouth was dry, and his hand was starting to shake from the precise cutting. Leather jacket guy smirked. Hey, check this out, he said, and he porked the frog he poked the frog in its eye with the scalpel. A weird liquid began to gush out. Sick, right? He then shoved the blade into the frog's arm and sliced it off. He picked up the tiny hand and waved it at Pete. Pete then shook his head. I need a break, he said. Look, I'm sorry, I swear I'll stop messing around. He then held out the little frog hand. Here, let's shake on it, the kid chuckled, as Pete then pushed off the stool and headed for the classroom water fountain. He took a long couple of drinks. Dang, he was thirsty, and he was starving. His stomach decided to growl then, since he had skipped breakfast fast, trying to make it to school on time. He was heading back to his workstation when Mr. Watson stopped him. Is everything going well, Mr. Dinglewood? He asked. Mr. Watson was shorter than him with white hair and a white mustache. Glasses hung on the tip of his nose, as if somehow he was looking down on Pete, even though that was physically impossible. Yep. Things are fine, Pete blurted out. Mr. Watson then frowned. I'm glad to hear that. Now, please return to your dissection table. You, of all people, cannot afford to fail. Then Pete started coughing again. That's what I'm doing, Pete muttered as he whirled around. It all went downhill from there. Pete took a quick, long stride from his foot and landed on his pack strip. Instead of landing securely on the floor, that was when he slipped, losing his grip, failing to fall forward. He fell backwards, and he felt his toe connect with leather jacket guy in a brutal way. The kid yelped, and Mr. Watson then shouted something in reply. Pete landed on his back, and his breath got knocked out of him. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes, he spotted the kid's scalpel in the air. The small knife must have flown up on impact, but then, in disbelief, Pete had seen that the scalp that was loose in gravity, and then it started falling towards his face. The point of the tiny blade was coming straight for his eye. Adrenaline then spread it out in his body. With the quick reflexes that came from years of playing football, Pete swatted the tool away like a deathly instinct just as the blade was about to blind him. The scalpel then hit the stand of the workstation and fell onto the floor. Holy, leather jacket guy hissed. Dear Lord, Peter, are you alright? Said Mr. Watson. He was now hovering over me like a frightened parent. Don't move, I'll call the nurse. Class, stay seated. Nobody move. Emergency procedure, please. Out of the way. The class ignored Mr. Watson and crowded around Pete as his chest then rose up and down with heavy breaths. He didn't think that he'd hit his head, but he felt dizzy and kind of out of it. Not to mention mortified. Somebody then whispered, Way to go, Dingleberry. A couple of kids giggled. Yeah, what a loser. Now we know why he was kicked off the football team. Pete slowly sat up as his face flushed red. Dang, there was no doubt that he should have stayed home. Somehow, Pete managed to get through the rest of the school day. The nurse had checked him out and given him an ice pack. And then they had sent him back on his way. It was a relief when the final bell had rang, and he quickly walked around, slowly moving through the kids, through the doors, and down the school's front steps. He then checked his phone, and he saw that he had a new text from his mother. He rubbed a hand over his face. What now? It couldn't be that it couldn't be that he couldn't get through one day without her asking him to do something. Yeah, he loved his mom, but now she didn't have his dad to help her. Pete was always on call. She better not have asked him to take Chuck out again. He didn't want to do it. He'd say, "Nope, sorry, I'm sick." He then clicked on the text. "Hi, Pete. After school, could you swing by the butcher and pick up my order of pork chops?" He responded flatly, "Fine." She responded, "Thank you." Heart emoji. Pete then popped a wad of watermelon gum into his mouth and then set off walking towards the butcher shop, which was a couple of blocks out of his way. He wanted to get his license so that he could be able to actually drive around, and that he was planned for 6 months ago. That would have been cool if he had a car then, before the divorce. And now everyone seemed to have forgotten. He finally had arrived at Barney's butcher shop during a lull. There were no cars parked in front, which was perfect, because then he could get the order and he could get out fast. Pete pushed through the glass doors, and no one was even behind the counter. Sale prices were posted on the glass, and some old rock music was playing from the back. He walked to the display case of raw meat, scanning left then right. "Hello?" he called out. "Yo, I got an order to pick up." There wasn't a bell to even ring, so he stood around another minute waiting for someone to come and help him. When no one came, he'd about had it. He knocked on the glass counter a couple of times. "Hello?" Finally, he took matters into his own hands, walking behind the tall display case. "Hey, anyone here or what?" On the other side of the case was a long butcher table with watery red liquid on it. The overpowering scent of meat and blood made his guts swish around again. The gum in his mouth then turned sour. At least the taste did. He put a hand to his stomach, as if he was trying to ease it. I will not blow chunks, he thought. He looked around to distract himself, but all that he had saw were pictures of butchered animals. Where he craned his head in another direction, he was surrounded by rows of lethal-looking knives and cleavers hanging above his head. A new wave of dizziness then washed over him. He then set his hand out for balance on the butcher table, and he felt a watery liquid on his fingertips, and he broke out in a cold sweat. Wham! A huge meat cleaver slammed down into the wood, barely missing his wrist. Pete shot backwards, protecting his hand against his chest, knocking into the display case with his pack. He gazed at the meat cleaver embedded in the wood. The handle vibrated in the air as if it was forced or had been incredibly strong. His gaze wiped up towards the hanging tools. One empty hook was swelling slowly. The meat cleaver had fallen from the hook. Fallen? He didn't think something could fall forcefully on its own. But what else could have happened? Hey, what are you doing back here? A stocky older man wearing a bloody apron waddled from into the area, wiping his hands with a towel. Employees only. Can't you read the sign? Pete pointed to the cleaver stuck in the butcher table. I, nah. Nah. You can't be playing with knives. You can't be playing with my knives, kid. You trying to get me in trouble, kid? Health department will have my license then. I spit it out. What's the matter with you? I didn't touch anything. It just fell. The old man narrowed his eyes. No way these knives would have just fallen from those hooks, kid. If that were the case, I'd be the old man that would be missing a lot more fingers than the ones that I already cut off. The old man raised his left hand to show a missing pinky and a ring finger with its top loaded off. The skin looked smooth on the two tawny, sharp finger stumps. When Pete started to shake, the man laughed. Oh, scared? Huh. You never seen someone with missing fingers before. Well, keep your fingers and hands away from sharp objects, kid, and you should be fine. Maybe. He cracked up again. Pete swallowed hard. Just here to pick up an I'm just here to pick up an order for Dinglewood. The butcher then waved a hand towards the back room. Yeah, got that in the fridge. Chops, right? I'll be right with you. Pete wimped open the front door to his house, and he slammed it as soon as he stormed through the door. He then tossed the pack onto the floor and strolled to the kitchen, where he opened the fridge. He threw the chomps in and he grabbed a soda. He then shut the door with his hips and struggled to close the door correctly. After getting it closed, he chugged the whole can. The cola smoothed his throat, and sweetness calmed a little. What a freaky day. He took off his cap and he ran his hand over his head. He just needed to eat, rest, and forget about everything. No more crazy dreams or weird kids with scalp pins, and definitely no more butcher shops. His mom was going to have to pick up the meat herself from now on. He then glanced out the kitchen window when he heard the backyard gate creak open. Chuck had pushed his bike in and leaned in onto the side of the house. He leaned it on the side of the house. Before coming through the side door, Pete felt his aggravation bubble up. Are you crazy? He asked Chuck. If Mom finds out that you biked to school, someone hogged the bathroom this morning, so I was late for the bus. Chuck interrupted him. And I didn't pick you up. I'm busted. I won't tell. Yeah, right. You always snitch. Chuck then rolled his eyes. I didn't tell her about you forcing me into the maintenance room, did I? No, not yet. But I saw how you wanted to tell her last night at dinner, and you thought you were real funny. Chuck then held up his hand in expression. Well, I didn't. That has to count for something. Pete then shrugged. Still, you can't be trusted. Fine. I should just tell her to get you busted then. How about that? See? You are a snitch. Shut up. You are. You shut up, you little twerp. Chuck Chuck gave in as well. Whatever jerk word, he muttered. He then grabbed a loaf of bread from the bread box, and then the peanut butter from the pantry, and then jelly from the fridge, and he pulled a butter knife from the drawer and started to make himself a sandwich. When he saw Pete eyeing his sandwich, he lifted his eyebrows. What? You want one? Pete hesitated. Don't know. Well, make your own. Pete then held a hand to his stomach, debating if he could even handle eating a sandwich. You still sick or something? Chuck wanted to know. He shrugged. It's just an off day. Ugh. Why? What happened? Pete then snapped. Don't worry about it. None of your business. No freaking way I'm going to tell anyone else about the embarrassing incident in the bio class and the flying cleavers, especially not to this twerp brother of mine, who would run and tell Mom and have her freak out. Fine then. Don't tell me, Chuck said. Chuck then finished making a sandwich and slid it across the counter towards Pete. A peace offering. Pete lifted his eyebrow in surprise as Chuck began to make another. You know, Mom filled out the organ donor paperwork for us, Chuck said. Like it was a casual conversation, Pete's jaw dropped. What? Why? Pete nodded, flashing his braces, looking almost pleased. She said that you would come around to the idea eventually, but I told her not to. Since when does Mom ever listen to what we want anyway? Chuck then took a bite of his sandwich and kept talking with his mouth full. It's not a big deal anyway. You're dead. Whenever your organs get taken, you're gonna be dead. So, your life or soul or whatever is gone. What do I care? Why do you even care so much? Pete didn't even know where to start. Here he was, trying to save his body parts all day long from his mom, all day long, and his mom was trying to give them away. It's just a stupid idea. Chuck then gave him a curious look. Wait, you're scared, aren't you? No, shut up. I then looked up. I looked it up. You'll want to know how they cut into you and take your organs. It's so cool. They split you open, like in a Y incision. Then your guts are all hanging out of your body. And then they are removing everything piece by piece. He made a weird face, with his eyes rolled backward and his tongue hanging out. Your intestines are going to be super long, right? And they're just going to pull them out like a long rope of link sausage. Chuck made a motion with his hands, like he was pulling out a long piece of rope from his stomach. I said to shut up. Pete then grabbed the sandwich and fled to his room. The next morning, Pete then slipped from his triple caffeine energy drink as he walked to school. The sun was out, which improved the walk a lot. Today had already had to be better than yesterday, he figured. Last night, he was having weird dreams again, but luckily the details had drifted away as soon as he woke up. And there hadn't been any flewing of his guts into the toilet, so that was already a score. He'd barely spoken to his mom last night, or this morning even. Why had she signed him up as a donator when he had told her not to? He was so mad about the thought of the fact that she didn't listen. He didn't even want to eat the pork chops, with what he had picked up last night, and all it did was remind him of how he nearly lost his hand. When he passed the construction site, he paused in a moment. He looked across the street and decided against crossing with all the busy traffic. Instead, he would go right under the scaffolding. Pete then scanned the boards above him, making sure there weren't any weird tools that could obviously fall and land on his head. He heard motorized saws and drills sounding from inside the site, but nothing coming and scaffolding. When he figured he was safe, he relaxed a little. Just in case, he walked cautiously under the boards. With quick glances above him, one thing he learned recently was that he couldn't be too careful, as he had nearly had to end the scaffolding. He then took a breath of release. A piece of cake! From inside the site, he heard a funny buzz and then a harsh clank. The hairs on Pete's arms then stood up. What the heck? Watch out! Someone shouted. Pete then spotted something moving fast in his peripheral vision. His head turned in time to see a circular buzz saw blade flying in a direction reminding him of a flying frisbee with sharp teeth. His jaw went slack and his adrenaline spiked. He dove backwards as the round blade flew through the air towards him. He then held up his hand in defense, like maybe he could catch it. Then he realized that was the worst thing to do, and he tried to pull his hand out of the path of the flying blade. He thought that he was home and free whenever he felt it slice into his flesh just above his wrist, following a sharp stinging. He crashed to the ground. His drink was pouring all over him. Air gushed out of his lungs. His eyes were wide as he lifted his arm, watching in shock as blood poured down his skin. Oh man, kid, someone call 911. A construction worker rushed over to his side, grabbing onto his helmet, as if not to be sure of what to do with his hand. Let me get a clean rag. Just don't move. The worker ran off, and other people started to gather around. Kid, are you okay? A man in a suit stood above Pete and leaned over. He had a phone to his ear. Hello? Yes? Uh-huh. Yeah. Alright. There had been an incident. There's a teenager. He's here. He's bleeding on the arm. At a construction site on Wilmington and Salisbury. Hurry, please. Don't worry. Kid, help is on the way. Yes. He is conscious, dazed. Pete then glanced over at the open gash on his arm. It wasn't very deep, but he could have died. Pete, Pete, Mom yelled as soon as she stepped out of onto the house. Pete, in my room, he called out. He was lying on the bed staring at the ceiling after the paramedic had already bandaged him up at the construction site. He called his mom and walked back home. He didn't even want to wait for a ride. He wanted to get out as far away from the construction site as possible. Now his energy was already all spent out. He noticed back at the front. His back was sore, and so he had gone to the bathroom, and he lifted his shirt in front of the mirror, as if his sliced arm wasn't bad enough. He also had a bunch of fresh scratches that were on his back from falling on the sidewalk, he assumed. Yesterday, he had a couple of those calls, but this latest incident was more dangerous. This time, there was actual blood. Mom swept into his bedroom in a flurry of nerves. Oh my gosh, my baby. Pete then sighed. Mom, I'm okay. It's only a small wound. I didn't need stitches. Everything's fine. She then gripped his hand, scanning the bandage on his arm. How did this happen? She felt his cheek ran a hand over his head and gave him a kiss on his forehead. I don't know why I struggled to read that sentence. Pete then looked at his arm and answered, honestly, don't know really. Her eyes then went wide. What do you mean don't know? What do you mean you really don't know? How would you not know? Were you not paying attention? Was the construction worker being rude, trying to hurt you or something? Do we need to call a lawyer? Maybe we should go to the hospital. No, I'm okay, Mom. Just relax. Jeez. While it was kind of nice to have all of her attention for once, her nerve-wracking behavior put me on edge. No, I am not relaxing. You could have really gotten hurt. She straightened and crossed her arms with a determined look on her face. That's it. You are not walking to school anymore. You can ride the bus or get a ride. Maybe I can change my schedule. I'll drive you and your brother to school. I think I can make it to work. Then she placed her hand on her lips as if she was suddenly Wonder Woman, and there was nothing that could stop her. I'll make it work. Mom, stop. It was just a freak accident. Pete then began to cough more, which he had been having to do a lot lately. There was a knock at the front door. Before it swung open, Pete shot up from his bed, startled. Who's that? Pete, it's just someone. I'll see. Hello, anybody home? Bellowed a familiar voice. Pete then stared at his mom accusingly. You called Dad? She said, Of course I called your father over here, Bill. Bill! In Pete's room, quickly. She started to pick up dirty clothes on the floor. I have to call him whenever there's an emergency. Gosh, Pete. I mean, this room is a mess. like that was anything new to say, Pete thought. Okay, so I'm on pause with the story. I'm at page 31 right now, and I'll continue the story some other time. Like, or like, subscribe, or at least comment if y'all want more videos like this. Bye.